Hey guys! So today is day number 9 of Inktober, and the piece that I create in today's video is quite a bit different than any I have done in this challenge prior to this moment. As I mentioned a couple of days ago when I was working on my sword piece, I'm trying to push myself into creating pieces that are more object-based as opposed to people-based. I really enjoy drawing people, and I will continue doing that in the very near future. But I wanted to push myself this month, and I didn't want to limit myself to a theme or an idea that ultimately doesn't define me or my style. So if you look at the piece itself, the main idea came from wanting to draw a light bulb, specifically an old-fashioned looking light bulb, with plants growing on the inside of it. Now, I did look this up, and apparently this is a thing to basically create terrariums, if that's how you say that, terrarium, inside of a light bulb. However, the idea did come to me before I realized that was a thing. I think that's a funny side effect of creativity, is often you'll have ideas that exist, but it's your interpretation of it that makes it unique. And so I decided to further expand on this idea of plants growing on the inside of a light bulb and create a plant out of the light bulb itself. So if you look at the bottom of the illustration, there are petals surrounding the base of the light bulb, sort of resembling petals of a flower. And this flower is not based on any flower that exists in real life, so it looks a little bit interesting. It looks a little bit off. But I personally believe that just is because it doesn't exist in real life. So naturally it's going to look a little bizarre because we're not expecting light bulbs to be in the centers of flowers. Initially, I was simply going to create a circle in the middle of my rectangular sheet of paper and then create the dark background around it. But the more I looked at it and I actually shifted my paper around on top of my light box to see where the best composition might be, I realized that it would be much more interesting to have the circle hanging partially off of the paper and then have another plant coming out of the top of it. Now the thing is, I really like this piece. It's very simple and very almost abstract, or surreal, or something that's not easily explained. I tend to draw a lot of sci-fi fantasy things, incorporating very subtle details to emphasize those ideas. But I don't often go full out into surrealism. To some extent, this is a little bizarre since surreal art is one of my favorite types of art. But this is really one of my first attempts at creating something that isn't even explained in the context of something like a fantasy piece. With something that is fantasy-based, you can explain a lot of things through the use of magic or different settings, and kind of the same thing with sci-fi. However, surrealism is its own separate thing. Its own separate category in which things are not real, and that's okay. And I think that's part of why I like it. I've always liked things that can't happen in real life. I think that's why I'm drawn so much to things like science fiction and fantasy, because although theoretically science fiction could happen in a future timeline, those things are not going to be experienced by us. And because of this, I feel as though my time is well spent reading and watching and generally engaging with these types of ideas. Whereas if I'm reading something that isn't necessarily nonfiction, but it's a fictional book that is extremely close to real life, I find that I'm not as interested. I am constantly thinking, oh, this could happen in real life. Why would I want that? Why am I wasting my time reading about this thing that is some random person's day-to-day life? And that's not to put down anyone that enjoys that type of fiction. It is perfectly valid in its own right, but it's just something that I'm not personally very passionate about. I don't really write that kind of fiction, I don't really read that kind of fiction, because I'm really passionate about things that can't happen in real life. And I think surrealism is kind of the art version of that. And so when I look at this piece and I see a flower that is centered around a light bulb, there are a lot of ways that can be taken, right? It can be simply an image because it looks interesting. It can be something about the growth of ideas and the development process. It can be something about how people grow from the light that is given off by other people's ideas. And it's all very personal to you. And though a lot of my images do have stories behind them, in this case, I would say alternate timeline, some sort of something about merging technology and organisms. And I'm very intrigued by that concept as well. It's something that once I started thinking about it, it really got the wheels turning, and I'm definitely interested in exploring it a little more in the future, merging technology with living things and what kinds of visual concepts could come about as a result of that. However, in this case, I like the idea of keeping it as a standalone image, because even though my images do typically have stories behind them, art is subjective. Art is meant to be interpreted by you in the way that you interpret it, and anything that I say shouldn't be able to change that. And this is something I've kind of been thinking a lot about, because I have been incorporating my stories into my artwork, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that, and I'm still going to continue doing that. But to say that my story and the way that I interpret it is the only way it can be seen is honestly kind of ridiculous. And that's a little bit difficult for me to handle because I'm a control freak in every sense of the word, and the thought of things not being interpreted correctly is something I've really struggled with. Specifically in things like fiction writing, where I will describe characters and I'll have a thought in the back of my mind like, what if people read this and they imagine someone completely different than I'm writing? And that stresses me out a little bit. However, after a lot of thought and relating my fiction to my illustrations, I've realized that it doesn't really matter in the long run, because fiction writing is not entirely about the visuals, and illustration is not solely about the story. To some degree it is, and it can be, and it's really what makes me excited about pieces. But it is to some degree about the aesthetics, in the same way that a novel or a piece of fiction is about the story. So I'm sorry if that got a little bit rambly. I just felt like I needed to get out some of the things I've been thinking about the past few days especially, most of which have been brought about due to Inktober and the process of creating artwork with stories every single day. I hope you all enjoyed this piece. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you guys tomorrow. Bye.